In 1942, 29 young men walked into a guarded room at Camp Pendleton, California, carrying nothing but pencils and paper. They emerged 8 weeks later with a weapon that would help win World War II. Not a bomb, not a gun. A code spoken in a language fewer than 30 non-Native Americans could understand. The Japanese military broke every American code they encountered. Army codes, Air Corps codes, diplomatic codes, every single one. Except this. They captured American soldiers who spoke the language natively and still couldn't crack it. Even after the war ended, Japanese intelligence officers admitted they had no idea what they were hearing. Here's what makes this impossible. The Japanese had some of the most sophisticated code-breaking operations in the world. They'd successfully decrypted British naval codes. They'd broken American diplomatic communications before Pearl Harbor. Their cryptanalysts were brilliant, methodical, ruthless. They analyzed patterns, frequency distributions, linguistic structures. They had teams of linguists studying every conceivable communication method. And they had access to anthropological research on Native American languages conducted before the war by German scholars. They knew these languages existed. They prepared for them. Yet across 6,000 miles of Pacific warfare, through every major marine assault from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, not a single Navajo transmission was ever successfully decoded by enemy forces. Not one. We're talking about over 800 messages transmitted without error during just the first 48 hours of Iwo Jima alone. Thousands upon thousands of tactical communications containing coordinates, troop movements, battle plans, all broadcast over open radio frequencies where Japanese intelligence could hear every word. And they understood nothing. The stakes couldn't have been higher. American Marines were island hopping across the Pacific, fighting some of the bloodiest battles in military history. Every tactical advantage mattered. Every minute of communication delay cost lives. Before this code existed, American forces needed 30 minutes to encrypt and transmit a 3-line message using standard military cryptography machines. The enemy was intercepting and decrypting American communications faster than commanders could adapt their strategies. Marines were dying because the Japanese knew where they'd land, where they'd attack, what they'd target. The American military desperately needed a communication system that was both unbreakable and instantaneous. The solution came from an unexpected source. A 49-year-old civil engineer living in Los Angeles who'd grown up on the Navajo reservation. His name was Philip Johnston, and he was one of perhaps 25 non-Navajo people in the entire world who could speak the language fluently. His parents had been missionaries, and he'd spent his childhood among the Navajo people, learning their language before he learned to write English. By age 9, he was translating for Navajo leaders in meetings with President Theodore Roosevelt. When World War I broke out, he served in France and learned that Native American languages had been used successfully for battlefield communications. In early 1942, Johnston read a newspaper article about Native American soldiers participating in army training exercises in Louisiana. Something clicked. He knew the military was desperate for an unbreakable code. He knew the Navajo language was extraordinarily complex, with tonal qualities and grammatical structures completely unlike any European or Asian language. And he knew that as an unwritten language, it couldn't be studied from textbooks or dictionaries. You had to learn it by living it. Within 24 hours of reading that article, Johnston was pitching his idea to the Marine Corps. The initial reaction was skepticism. The military had tried using Native American code talkers in World War I with the Choctaw language, and while it had worked, the Germans knew about it. In fact, Nazi Germany had sent over 30 anthropologists to the United States in the 1930s specifically to study Native American languages in preparation for future conflicts. The Marine Corps brass worried that any indigenous language might be vulnerable. They worried about logistics. Could enough Navajo speakers be recruited? They worried about complexity. Could Marines who didn't speak Navajo work alongside code talkers effectively? They worried about 100 practical problems. Johnston convinced them to give him a chance to demonstrate. He tracked down 4 Navajo men working in Los Angeles shipyards and brought them to Camp Elliott near San Diego on February 28, 1942. The demonstration was brutally simple. Major General Clayton Vogel, commanding general of the Amphibious Corps Pacific Fleet, wrote out 6 typical combat messages. The Navajo speakers were placed in separate rooms with field telephones connecting them. One would receive an English message, translate it into Navajo, transmit it, and the other would translate it back to English. The entire process took seconds. One test message read, "Enemy expected to make tank and dive bomber attack at dawn." It came back, "Enemy tank dive bomber expected to attack this morning." Nearly perfect, nearly instantaneous. But something unexpected happened during that demonstration, something that would define the entire Code Talker program. The Navajo speakers realized immediately that direct translation wouldn't work for military terminology. The Navajo language had no words for tank, submarine, bomber, grenade, or dozens of other military terms. Conversational Navajo couldn't handle modern warfare. Right there, during the demonstration, they made a crucial decision. They'd need to create a code within the language, using word substitution and letter encoding to represent military concepts. A tank became a turtle. A submarine became an iron fish. Aircraft became birds. A fighter plane was a hummingbird. A bomber was a buzzard. Shells were eggs. General Vogel was impressed enough to recommend recruiting 200 Navajo men for a pilot program. But headquarters authorized only 30. If the program failed, the military didn't want to waste resources. If it succeeded, they'd scale up. On May 4th, 1942, 29 Navajo men boarded a bus at Fort Wingate, New Mexico, heading to Marine Corps boot camp in San Diego. These 29 would become known as the First 29, the original Navajo Code Talkers who would create the code itself. They had no formal cryptographic training, no background in linguistics or code theory. Most had never traveled far from the Navajo reservation. Some had only recently graduated from high school. What they did have was an impossible mission. The Marine Corps gave them 8 weeks to create a military code based on their language that could handle any combat situation, that could be memorized without written materials, that could be transmitted clearly under combat conditions with artillery shells exploding around them, and that would be absolutely impervious to enemy code breaking. 8 weeks to build a communication system that would become the backbone of the entire Pacific Island campaign. If they failed, American forces would continue bleeding intelligence to Japanese cryptanalysts. If they succeeded, they'd give the United States Marine Corps an advantage that might help win the war. And here's the twist that makes this story even more remarkable. These young Navajo men were being asked to use their native language to help defend a nation that had spent decades trying to erase that very language from existence. Most of them had attended government or religious boarding schools where speaking Navajo was strictly forbidden. Children caught speaking their native language were punished, sometimes physically. The goal was forced assimilation, cultural erasure. Many of these men had been beaten or had their mouths washed out with soap. For speaking the language, they were now being asked to weaponize for military advantage. But nobody expected what would happen next. In those 8 weeks at Camp Pendleton, these 29 Navajo Marines would create something that Japanese intelligence never came close to breaking. The first 29 approached their mission with a combination of marine discipline and cultural knowledge that nobody in the military had anticipated. They worked 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, locked in a secure room where everything they created was immediately classified. They couldn't discuss their work with anyone outside that room. They couldn't write anything down that might be discovered. They couldn't even explain to their families what they were doing. The pressure was enormous. American forces were losing ground in the Pacific. Every day they spent developing the code was another day American Marines were fighting without secure communications. They divided the challenge into two parts, a vocabulary code and an alphabet code. For the vocabulary code, they created Navajo terms for over 200 military words and phrases. These weren't literal translations. They were creative substitutions that made sense within Navajo culture and worldview. Ships became different types of water vessels in Navajo tradition. Aircraft became birds. Military ranks became traditional Navajo leadership roles. A major general became 2 stars. A lieutenant became 1 silver bar. Each term had to be something that could be easily remembered, quickly pronounced, and clearly understood even over a crackling radio transmission in the chaos of combat. But the alphabet code was the stroke of genius that made the system truly unbreakable. They assigned Navajo words to each letter of the English alphabet, words whose first letter in English would spell out messages. A was represented by Wullachi, which means ant. B was Shush, which means bear. C was Mosi, which means cat. This meant that even if the Japanese somehow obtained the vocabulary code, they still couldn't decipher spelled-out words without also having the alphabet key. And here's the brilliant part. They created multiple Navajo words for the most common English letters to prevent frequency analysis, a standard code-breaking technique. The letter E, the most common letter in English, could be represented by Dze for elk, Aja for ear, or Ana for eye. The system they created was effectively a code wrapped inside a language, wrapped inside another code. First, you'd take an English military message. Second, you'd determine whether the words existed in the Navajo vocabulary code. Third, if they did, you'd substitute the Navajo term. Fourth, if they didn't, you'd spell them out using the Navajo alphabet code. Fifth, you'd transmit the entire message in Navajo. Sixth, the receiving code talker would reverse the process. And all of this had to happen in real time under combat conditions with absolute accuracy. A single error could send Marines to the wrong coordinates, call artillery down on friendly positions, or reveal battle plans to the enemy. During training, the pressure to memorize was relentless. There were no written code books to reference in the field. Every vocabulary word, every alphabet equivalent, every pronunciation had to be permanently embedded in memory. Code talkers would quiz each other constantly, randomly calling out English terms and demanding instant Navajo translations. They practiced in simulated combat conditions, with instructors screaming at them, banging pots and pans to simulate gunfire, forcing them to concentrate through chaos. Because that's what combat would be. Chaos, noise, terror, and they'd need to transmit coordinates and orders perfectly while Marines' lives hung in the balance. Testing the code speed became an obsession. Marine communication officers would time how long it took to encrypt, transmit, and decrypt messages using standard military cryptography machines versus the Navajo code. The results were staggering. A 3-line message that required 30 minutes with conventional encryption took 20 seconds with code talkers. 20 seconds. That meant battlefield commanders could make tactical decisions based on real-time intelligence instead of intelligence that was 30 minutes old. In warfare, 30 minutes is eternity. Enemy positions shift. Opportunities disappear. Marines advance or die based on information that's either current or obsolete. By the end of their 8-week intensive training, the first 29 had created a code consisting of 211 terms. They'd tested it exhaustively. They'd proven it could be transmitted quickly and accurately. They'd shown that it worked under simulated combat conditions. And they'd done something else. They'd proven that young Navajo Marines could master the system and teach it to others. The Marine Corps was convinced. In July 1942, they authorized recruiting 200 additional Navajo Code Talkers. The program was expanding, But the real test wasn't in a training facility in California. It was coming in the Solomon Islands, on a miserable jungle island called Guadalcanal, where American forces were about to launch their first major offensive in the Pacific. When the first Navajo Code Talkers deployed to Guadalcanal in August 1942, they had no idea whether their code would actually work in combat. Training simulations were one thing, real warfare was something else entirely. The Japanese controlled vast stretches of the Pacific. They'd conquered territory from Manchuria to New Guinea, from the Philippines to the edge of Australia. American forces were finally ready to stop retreating and start attacking. The target was Guadalcanal, a relatively small island in the Solomon chain that the Japanese were using as an airbase to threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. If the Americans could take Guadalcanal, they could start rolling back Japanese expansion. If they failed, the entire Pacific strategy might collapse. The Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, expecting heavy resistance. Instead, they found the Japanese forces had retreated into the jungle. The American forces captured the airfield, later renamed Henderson Field, with minimal casualties. But holding the island would prove far more difficult than taking it. For the next 6 months, Japanese and American forces fought for control in some of the most brutal combat conditions imaginable. Jungle warfare, tropical diseases, supply shortages, and constant, relentless Japanese counterattacks aimed at retaking Henderson Field. This was the environment where the Navajo Code would face its first real test. Code talkers worked in pairs, typically assigned to different levels of command. They'd be positioned wherever communication was critical, at battalion headquarters, at regimental command posts with artillery units. They carried bulky radio equipment weighing up to 80 pounds through jungle terrain. They worked around the clock, transmitting tactical orders, coordinates for artillery strikes, requests for supplies and reinforcements, intelligence about enemy movements. And they did all of this while Japanese snipers specifically targeted radio operators. The enemy knew that killing communication personnel could disrupt American operations. Code talkers had to keep moving, stay hidden, and maintain perfect accuracy under conditions where most people couldn't think straight. What happened at Guadalcanal exceeded every expectation. The code worked flawlessly. Messages that would have taken 30 minutes to encrypt and transmit conventionally were being sent in seconds. Battlefield commanders could adapt to changing tactical situations in real time. When Japanese forces launched surprise attacks, American units could coordinate defensive responses instantly. When Marine patrols discovered enemy positions, they could call in artillery support before the enemy moved. The speed advantage was revolutionary, but the security advantage was even more important. The Japanese were intercepting every radio transmission. Their intelligence officers were recording every message, analyzing every pattern, searching for any weakness in American communications. And they found nothing. They couldn't identify the language being used. They couldn't recognize patterns. They couldn't break the code. Japanese intelligence was baffled. They knew the Americans had changed something about their communications, but they couldn't figure out what. Intercepted Navajo transmissions sounded like random syllables, meaningless sounds with no discernible structure. Japanese linguists analyzed recordings. They consulted with every language expert they could access. They even brought in a Navajo soldier who'd been captured by Japanese forces in the Philippines early in the war, hoping he could translate the messages. He listened to recordings of code talker transmissions and was completely confused. He could recognize that the language being spoken was Navajo, but the words didn't make sense. A tank wasn't called a tank. It was called a turtle. Coordinates weren't stated directly. They were spelled out using the alphabet code. He had no frame of reference for understanding what the words meant in their military context. This was the elegant brilliance of the system. Even if the Japanese somehow learned they were listening to Navajo, that knowledge was useless without the code vocabulary. And even if they somehow obtained the vocabulary code, they still needed the alphabet code to decipher spelled-out terms. And even if they obtained both codes, they'd need fluent Navajo speakers to apply them, speakers who understood the complex tonal and grammatical nuances that changed meanings based on pronunciation. The Japanese never got close, not at Guadalcanal, not at any battle afterward. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, Japan's chief of intelligence, would admit after the war that while Japanese cryptanalysts successfully broke American Army and Army Air Corps codes, they never cracked the Marine Corps code. They didn't even understand what they were hearing. The success at Guadalcanal proved the code's value, but it also revealed how physically and mentally demanding the work was. Code talkers weren't just translators sitting safely behind the lines. They were Marines first, code talkers second. They pulled guard duty, they dug foxholes, they participated in patrols. And when casualties mounted among infantry Marines, code talkers sometimes had to grab rifles and fight. The Guadalcanal campaign lasted 6 months, from August 1942 to February 1943, and the code talkers worked continuously. They dealt with the same tropical diseases, the same supply shortages, the same psychological stress as every other Marine on the island. Except they also bore the weight of knowing that if they made a mistake, if they transposed a coordinate or mistranslated an order, Marines could die. As word spread about the code's effectiveness, demand for Navajo Code Talkers exploded. The Marine Corps began recruiting more aggressively on the Navajo reservation. They needed code talkers for every Marine division, every regimental combat team, every specialized unit. By 1943, the recruitment and training pipeline was running constantly. New classes of Navajo Marines went through boot camp, then reported to Camp Pendleton for Code Talker School. The code itself was expanding, from the original 211 terms to over 400 by the end of the war. New military equipment needed new code terms. New tactical situations required new vocabulary. The code wasn't static, it evolved with the war. But recruiting on the Navajo reservation presented challenges nobody had anticipated. In 1942, there were roughly 50,000 Navajo people, and about 540 eventually served as Marines. Of those, between 375 and 420 were trained as code talkers. The rest served in other capacities. But recruiting that many young men from a single community had profound impacts. Entire families sent multiple sons to war. Small communities on the reservation lost significant percentages of their young male population. And because the code was classified, these men couldn't explain why they were needed, what they'd be doing, or why the military specifically wanted Navajo speakers. Families just knew their sons were leaving for the Marine Corps, one of the most dangerous branches of service, to fight in the Pacific, where casualty rates were horrific. The code talkers also faced a unique danger that had nothing to do with enemy action. Several times during Pacific campaigns, American soldiers mistook Navajo Marines for Japanese soldiers. The physical features, the dark hair, the accent when speaking English, all of it led to tragic cases of mistaken identity. To prevent friendly fire incidents, some code talkers were assigned bodyguards, Marines whose official job was to protect the code talker from enemy capture. But there was an unofficial, unspoken secondary duty. If the code talker was about to be captured, the bodyguard was supposed to shoot him to prevent the Japanese from interrogating him about the code. This was never stated explicitly in official orders, but several code talkers later confirmed that they understood this was part of the arrangement. They were so valuable that their own military would kill them rather than risk the code being compromised. The next major test came at Tarawa in November 1943. If Guadalcanal was brutal, Tarawa was apocalyptic. A tiny coral atoll, barely 300 acres in size, defended by 4,800 Japanese troops who'd spent months fortifying every inch of ground. The American invasion plan called for landing Marines directly on the beaches under withering fire. Pre-invasion intelligence suggested the water surrounding the atoll was deep enough for landing craft to reach the shore. The intelligence was wrong. The landing craft grounded on coral reefs hundreds of yards from the beach. Marines had to wade through chest-deep water under murderous machine gun fire, while Japanese defenders had clear fields of fire from concrete bunkers. Code Talkers landed with the first waves of Marines. They carried their radio equipment through the water, trying to keep it functional, while bullets churned the ocean around them. Once on the beach, they transmitted continuous updates on the battle's progress, called for naval gunfire support, coordinated reinforcements. The casualties at Tarawa were staggering. Over 1,000 Americans killed and 2,100 wounded in 76 hours of fighting. The Code Talkers worked through all of it. When their radio equipment was destroyed by Japanese fire, they found replacement equipment. When they were wounded, they kept transmitting until medics forced them to stop. The messages never stopped flowing. What made Tarawa significant for the Code's development was complexity. This wasn't a 6-month campaign like Guadalcanal. It was 76 hours of concentrated, chaotic violence, where every minute required dozens of command decisions. Coordinates for naval artillery had to be transmitted instantly and perfectly. Too far, and the shells would land on Marines. Too close, and they'd miss Japanese positions. Requests for medical evacuation had to be prioritized rapidly as casualties mounted faster than aid stations could handle. Status reports had to flow continuously so commanders offshore could make decisions about reinforcing battered units or pulling them back. The Code handled all of it without a single known instance of mistranslation or error. Japanese intelligence was now fully aware that the Americans had implemented some kind of revolutionary communication system. They'd been monitoring Marine Corps transmissions for over a year. They'd intercepted thousands of messages. They'd captured radio equipment. They'd interrogated prisoners. And they still couldn't break the code. Their cryptanalysts tried everything: frequency analysis, pattern recognition, linguistic deconstruction. Nothing worked. They couldn't even confirm what language was being used. Some Japanese intelligence reports speculated it might be a constructed language, an artificial code with no connection to any real human language. Others theorized it was some obscure dialect that Allied linguists had discovered and weaponized. By 1944, the code was being used across all 6 Marine divisions and in Marine Raider battalions and parachute units. Code Talkers were present at every major Pacific engagement: Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu. Each battle brought new challenges. At Saipan, American forces faced over 30,000 Japanese defenders on an island with mountains, caves, and dense vegetation that made communication difficult. Radio signals bounced off terrain, were absorbed by foliage, got drowned out by artillery bombardment. Code Talkers had to adapt their transmission techniques, find positions with clear sight lines, sometimes climb exposed areas to get better radio reception. They did whatever it took to maintain communication. The physical toll was cumulative. Unlike most Marines who rotated out after extended campaigns, Code Talkers were in such high demand that they often went from one battle directly to another without the normal rest period. Their expertise was too valuable. They couldn't be replaced by Marines from other units because nobody else could speak the code. This meant Code Talkers experienced combat over and over without the psychological recovery time that's critical for mental health. Many later said they never processed what they'd experienced until years after the war ended. They just kept moving from island to island, battle to battle, transmitting coordinates and orders while Marines fought and died around them. By early 1945, American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands. The strategy was to capture islands close enough to Japan to launch bombing raids and eventually stage an invasion. Iwo Jima was the target, a volcanic island with strategic airfields that could be used as bases for fighters escorting bombers over Japan. The Japanese knew Iwo Jima was critical. They'd spent months fortifying the island with bunkers, tunnels, hidden artillery positions. 21,000 Japanese defenders were dug into volcanic rock, determined to make the Americans pay for every yard of ground. The Battle of Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945. 70,000 Marines assaulted an island barely 8 square miles in size. The fighting was savage. Japanese defenders fought from tunnels and caves. They'd emerge, attack, then disappear underground before Marines could respond. Artillery and airstrikes were largely ineffective against underground fortifications. Marines had to advance across open ground under constant fire, clearing bunkers one by one with flamethrowers and grenades. The battle that military planners estimated would take 5 days lasted 36 days. American casualties exceeded 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. Japanese casualties were over 20,000, with only about 200 prisoners taken. 6 Navajo Code Talkers worked around the clock during the first 48 hours of the Iwo Jima assault. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, later stated unequivocally that without the Navajo Code Talkers, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. During those first 2 days, those 6 Code Talkers sent and received over 800 messages without a single error. 800 messages, 0 errors, under conditions where Marines were dying by the hundreds, where artillery shells were exploding continuously, where radio equipment was getting destroyed by Japanese fire and had to be constantly replaced, where exhaustion, stress and fear were overwhelming. 800 messages without error. That's not just competence, that's extraordinary discipline under impossible conditions. Think about what that means practically. Each message contained critical information: coordinates for naval gunfire support, locations of Japanese strongpoints, requests for ammunition and medical supplies, updates on unit positions, orders for tactical movements. A single error in a coordinate could mean friendly fire casualties. A mistake in relaying troop positions could lead to units being cut off and surrounded. A mistranslated order could result in Marines attacking the wrong objective. 800 opportunities for fatal errors, 0 mistakes. Major Connor understood exactly what that meant. The Marines' ability to adapt tactics in real time, to coordinate complex multi-unit assaults, to call in supporting fire precisely where needed, all of that depended on the Code Talkers' absolute accuracy. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi during the Iwo Jima battle became one of the most famous images of World War II. What most people don't know is that the first message sent from the summit after the flag was raised was transmitted by a Navajo Code Talker. The message simply stated that Mount Suribachi had been secured, but that message meant everything. It told commanders that the highest point on the island was in American hands. It meant artillery observers could now direct fire across the entire battlefield. It meant one phase of the battle was complete and Marines could advance to the next objective. One short message, transmitted in Navajo, understood instantly by American command, meaningless to Japanese intelligence intercepting the transmission. After Iwo Jima came Okinawa, the final major battle before the planned invasion of Japan itself. Okinawa was even larger and more heavily defended than Iwo Jima. The battle lasted 82 days and resulted in over 12,000 American deaths and over 50,000 casualties. Code Talkers participated throughout. By this point in the war, the code had expanded to 411 terms. New vocabulary was constantly being added as new weapon systems were deployed and new tactical situations emerged. The Code Talkers were so experienced that they could adapt to changes instantaneously, incorporating new terms and maintaining the same flawless accuracy they'd demonstrated since Guadalcanal. But something else was happening by 1945 that nobody in the military had fully anticipated. The psychological cost of continuous combat exposure was taking its toll. Code Talkers were experiencing what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though that term wouldn't be coined for decades. They'd seen horrors repeatedly. They'd transmitted messages calling for medics while watching Marines bleed out. They'd coordinated artillery strikes and then seen the aftermath. They'd participated in assaults where friends died beside them. And because their work was classified, they couldn't talk about any of it with anyone who wasn't cleared to know about the code. They couldn't process their experiences, even with other Marines who'd been in the same battles. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the war ended abruptly. Japan surrendered. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands was cancelled. Millions of lives, American, Japanese, Allied, were saved by not having to fight through every city and town in Japan. But for the Code Talkers, the end of the war brought a new challenge. The code was still classified. The Marine Corps believed it might be needed in future conflicts, so the Code Talkers were ordered not to discuss their work with anyone. Not their families, not other veterans, not historians. They were told to stay silent about their contribution to winning the war. This enforced silence lasted until 1968, 23 years. For 23 years, these men who'd helped win the Pacific War couldn't tell their own children what they'd done. They attended veteran reunions where other Marines talked about their service, and the Code Talkers had to remain vague about their roles. They watched documentaries and read books about Pacific battles they'd participated in, and none of the accounts mentioned Code Talkers. They carried the weight of their experiences alone, unable to share the burden, unable to seek support from a nation that didn't know what they'd accomplished. When the code was finally declassified in 1968, recognition was slow. Some attention came in the 1970s and 1980s, but it wasn't until 2001 that the original 29 Code Talkers received Congressional Gold Medals. By then, most were in their 70s or 80s. Some had already passed away. The Code Talkers who trained after the first 29 received Congressional Silver Medals. President George W. Bush presented the medals in a ceremony at the Capitol, saying these men had brought honor to their nation and victory to their country. The recognition was meaningful, but it came decades too late for many. The Navajo Code Talkers story is full of paradoxes that make it almost too ironic to be true. These men were asked to defend a country that had actively tried to erase their language and culture. They were educated in boarding schools that punished them for speaking Navajo, then recruited by a military that needed that language to survive. They were second-class citizens on their own land. Navajos couldn't vote in Arizona until 1948, in New Mexico until 1953, in Utah until 1957. They faced discrimination in restaurants and hotels when traveling off the reservation, yet they volunteered to fight for the United States in one of its most desperate wars. The code they created represented something profound beyond its military utility. It was proof that indigenous knowledge, indigenous language, indigenous culture had immense value that the dominant society had failed to recognize. For decades, American policy toward Native Americans had been based on forced assimilation, the explicit goal of destroying indigenous cultures and replacing them with European American culture. The boarding schools were instruments of cultural genocide, designed to eliminate indigenous languages within a generation. The Navajo Code Talkers proved that indigenous languages weren't primitive or backwards or obstacles to progress. They were sophisticated, complex, and powerful enough to help win a global war. The technical reasons the code was unbreakable reveal just how unique Navajo is as a language. First, it's a tonal language where pitch changes word meaning, similar to Chinese, but with completely different phonetic structures. Second, it has complex verb conjugations, where a single verb can contain information that would require an entire sentence in English. Third, it has sounds that don't exist in European or Asian languages. Speakers have to learn these sounds from childhood, because adult speakers of other languages physically cannot reproduce them accurately. Fourth, it had no alphabet or written form, meaning there were no texts for cryptanalysts to study. Fifth, the number of fluent non-Navajo speakers worldwide was probably under 30 in 1942. All of these factors combined to create an unbreakable foundation for the code. But the code itself added additional layers of security. The vocabulary substitutions meant that even someone fluent in Navajo couldn't understand military transmissions without knowing what military terms were represented by which Navajo words. The alphabet code meant that even with the vocabulary, you couldn't decipher spelled-out terms without the alphabet key. And the speed requirement meant code talkers couldn't pause to think. They had to translate instantaneously, which required absolute mastery. The entire system was elegantly designed by Marines with no formal cryptographic training. They created something professional cryptanalysts said was theoretically impossible, a tactical field code that was both perfectly secure and perfectly fast. The broader strategic impact is almost impossible to calculate precisely. How many American lives were saved because tactical communications couldn't be intercepted? How many battles were won because commanders could adapt in real time instead of working with 30-minute-old intelligence? How many Japanese ambushes failed because they never knew what they were listening to? Major Connor believed the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima without the Code Talkers. Other commanders said similar things about other battles. The Code Talkers themselves were modest about their contributions, insisting they were just doing their jobs as Marines. After the war, many Code Talkers struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. They'd experienced prolonged combat trauma without the psychological support structures that would become standard for veterans in later conflicts. They'd lived through experiences they couldn't discuss because the code remained classified. Many returned to the Navajo reservation, where opportunities for education and employment were limited. Some became traditional healers and participated in Navajo healing ceremonies designed to help warriors process combat experiences and reintegrate into community life. These ceremonies, enemy way and other traditional rites, provided spiritual and psychological healing that mainstream American medicine wasn't offering veterans at that time. The technological legacy is fascinating. Modern cryptography is entirely digital, based on mathematical algorithms and computational complexity. But the principle behind the Navajo Code, using a foundation that your enemy cannot access, remains valid. You can have the most sophisticated encryption algorithm in the world, but if your enemy can intercept your keys, they can break your code. The Navajo Code was unbreakable because the foundation was a language almost nobody could speak. That's not a mathematical advantage, that's a knowledge advantage. It's security through obscurity, taken to its logical extreme. What's remarkable is that the same principle was attempted with other Native American languages during World War II. Code talkers from at least 14 other tribes served in various capacities: Comanche, Choctaw, Cherokee, and others. Some of these programs were successful, but the Navajo program was by far the largest and most systematically implemented. Over 400 Navajo Code Talkers served. They participated in every major marine assault in the Pacific. They transmitted tens of thousands of messages, and not one was ever successfully decoded by the enemy. That level of operational security is unprecedented in modern military history. The human cost within the Navajo community was significant. 13 Code Talkers were killed in action. Many more were wounded physically. Essentially, all of them were wounded psychologically. Entire communities on the reservation lost young men who never came home. Families waited for news about sons and brothers who couldn't explain where they were or what they were doing. The pride these communities felt about their sons' service was mixed with grief and confusion. Why did the military specifically want Navajo speakers? What were they doing that was so important? Those questions couldn't be answered for decades. The silence imposed on the code talkers also meant their accomplishments weren't part of the historical record for an entire generation. Books about the Pacific War written in the 1950s and 1960s don't mention code talkers at all. Histories of military cryptography discuss Enigma machines and Japanese naval codes, but completely omit the Navajo contribution. It's as if they didn't exist. Students learned about Pearl Harbor, Midway, Iwo Jima, but not about the communication system that helped secure those victories. This historical erasure compounded the psychological burden the code talkers carried. They'd done something extraordinary, and the world didn't know and couldn't be told. When recognition finally came decades later, it revealed how little most Americans understood about Native American contributions to the war effort. Over 44,000 Native Americans served in World War II out of a total Native American population of around 350,000. That's one of the highest per capita participation rates of any ethnic group in America. Yet that service was largely invisible in mainstream historical narratives. The code talkers became the most famous Native American contribution to the war, but they represented a much larger pattern of service and sacrifice that had gone unacknowledged. The declassification in 1968 happened quietly, without much fanfare. It wasn't a presidential announcement or major news story. The Marine Corps simply decided the code was no longer strategically valuable and removed the classification. Some Navajo veterans started talking about their experiences, tentatively at first. They'd kept the secret so long that breaking their silence felt strange. Some worried they might still get in trouble for discussing classified information. They'd been so thoroughly conditioned to stay quiet that even official declassification wasn't enough to immediately open up about their experiences. What emerged as code talkers began sharing their stories was how deeply the experience had shaped their lives. They'd been teenagers or young men when they enlisted, most between 18 and 25 years old. They'd gone directly from the Navajo reservation to Marine Corps boot camp to some of the most intense combat in human history. They'd seen friends die. They'd called in artillery strikes that killed thousands. They'd participated in assaults where survival was uncertain. And they'd done all of this while bearing the unique burden of knowing that their capture could compromise not just their unit, but the entire communication system the Marines depended on. The question of whether the code could have been broken is interesting. Professional cryptanalysts who've studied the Navajo Code say that with enough time, enough resources, and enough intercepted messages, any code can theoretically be broken. But warfare doesn't allow unlimited time. The Japanese would have needed years of focused effort by teams of linguists and cryptanalysts. They would have needed access to Navajo speakers willing to cooperate. They would have needed to capture code books or code talkers who could be interrogated successfully. None of that happened. The war moved too fast. The code changed too frequently. The security around code talkers was too tight. So in practical terms, the code was unbreakable because the conditions necessary to break it never materialized. There's also the question of what would have happened if the Japanese had figured out the code was based on Navajo. Would they have been able to exploit that knowledge? Probably not. Knowing a message is in Navajo doesn't help you understand military code vocabulary. You'd need the code book, which was memorized and never written down in the field. You'd need the alphabet code, which was separately memorized. And you'd need fluent Navajo speakers to apply those codes, which Japan didn't have access to. The layered security meant that breaking through one layer didn't compromise the whole system. The irony of using an oppressed language as a weapon of liberation isn't lost on historians. The US government spent decades trying to eliminate Native American languages through boarding schools and forced assimilation policies. Then, when crisis came, that same government desperately needed those languages to survive. It's a reminder that cultural diversity isn't just morally right, it's strategically valuable. The knowledge, skills, and perspectives that minority cultures bring aren't obstacles to national unity. They're assets that can be critical when circumstances demand unique solutions to unprecedented problems. Modern Navajo communities view the Code Talkers with immense pride. They're celebrated as warriors who brought honor to the Navajo people while contributing to a larger cause. Schools on the Navajo reservation teach about the Code Talkers. August 14th is recognized as Navajo Code Talkers Day in recognition of their service. The Code Talkers have become symbols of Native American resilience, survivors of cultural genocide who turned their persecuted language into a weapon that helped win a global war. That's a powerful narrative of resistance and adaptation. But there's also complexity in how Code Talkers themselves felt about their service. Some were proud and felt they'd proven the value of Native American culture to a nation that had dismissed it. Others were ambivalent, grateful they'd survived but troubled by what they'd experienced and how they'd been treated afterward. Some struggled with the contradiction of fighting for a country that denied them basic rights. There's no single Code Talker perspective. Like all veterans, they process their experiences individually, shaped by personality, circumstances, and life after military service. The last of the original 29 Code Talkers died in 2014. His name was Chester Nez, and he was 93 years old. His death marked the end of a direct link to the creation of the Code. Other Code Talkers who trained later are still alive as of recent years, but they're in their 90s and the number dwindles annually. Within a few years, there will be no living Code Talkers. Their stories will exist only in recordings, interviews, books, and memories. That's the inevitable passage of time, but it makes preserving their history even more urgent. What lessons does this story offer today? First, that security through obscurity can work if the foundation is truly inaccessible to adversaries. Second, that speed and security don't have to be trade-offs. Sometimes you can have both if you design the system correctly. Third, that diversity is a strategic asset. The unique knowledge within minority communities can be invaluable when mainstream approaches fail. Fourth, that cultural preservation has practical implications beyond moral arguments. Languages and traditions that seem obsolete might someday prove critical. Fifth, that individuals facing oppression can still choose to serve larger causes without endorsing the systems that oppress them. The Navajo Code represents something rare in military history, a perfect security record. 0 messages successfully decoded by the enemy, 0 compromises from captured personnel, 0 defeats attributable to communications failure. In an era where military codes were being broken routinely, where intelligence failures led to catastrophic defeats, the Navajo Code stood alone as completely secure. Professional cryptographers have studied it extensively. They've found no weaknesses. Given the technology and knowledge available in the 1940s, the code was effectively unbreakable. Compare that to other World War II codes. The German Enigma machine was eventually broken by Allied cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park. Japanese naval codes were compromised, giving the Americans crucial intelligence that led to victory at Midway. American military codes were being read by Japanese intelligence throughout the early Pacific campaigns. But the Navajo Code? Never broken, never compromised, never even understood well enough for the enemy to know what language they were hearing. That's extraordinary. The technological sophistication of modern cryptography makes the Navajo Code seem primitive. We have encryption algorithms based on prime number factorization that would take quantum computers years to break. We have blockchain technologies that distribute trust across networks. We have security protocols with layers of authentication that the 1940s couldn't imagine. But all of that technology is vulnerable to a simple reality. If someone steals your keys, your encryption fails. The Navajo Code had no keys to steal. The key was a language almost nobody could speak, memorized vocabulary that was never written down, and cultural knowledge that couldn't be obtained without living among Navajo communities for years. That brings us back to the beginning. 29 young Navajo men walked into a room at Camp Pendleton in 1942 with an impossible assignment: create a military code that's both unbreakable and instantaneous. Do it in 8 weeks. Memorize everything because nothing can be written down. Make it work under combat conditions where people are shooting at you and you're exhausted and terrified. Make it so reliable that thousands of Marines will trust their lives to your accuracy. And do all of this in a language the government tried to force you to forget. They succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. They created a weapon that helped win the Pacific War. They transmitted messages that saved thousands of American lives. They proved that indigenous knowledge has value the dominant culture hadn't recognized. And they did it all while maintaining absolute secrecy, enduring combat trauma, and receiving virtually no recognition for decades. That's not just a story about military cryptography. It's a story about resilience, ingenuity, cultural survival, and the unexpected ways that oppressed peoples can contribute to causes larger than themselves while maintaining their identity and dignity. The final irony? The language that the US government tried to eliminate through boarding schools and forced assimilation helped save that same government when it faced existential threat. The culture that was deemed primitive and backwards contained knowledge sophisticated enough to baffle the best cryptanalysts in the Japanese Empire. The young men who were punished for speaking their native language became some of the most valuable Marines in the Pacific Theater. That's not just historical irony, that's vindication. The Navajo language wasn't an obstacle to progress. It was a strategic asset, powerful enough to change the course of history. And here's the thing that should make you think. How many other times in history have dominant cultures destroyed knowledge they didn't understand, only to later discover they needed it? How much indigenous wisdom has been lost because colonizers dismissed it as primitive? How many languages have gone extinct that might have contained unique ways of thinking about problems we can't solve? The Navajo Code Talkers represent the rare case where indigenous knowledge survived long enough to prove its value in terms the dominant culture could understand: military victory. What if other indigenous languages had been preserved instead of suppressed? What if traditional knowledge systems had been respected instead of dismissed? We'll never know what was lost, but we know what was saved. 420 Navajo Marines proved that their language, their culture, their way of thinking about the world had value that extended far beyond their own communities. They proved it in the most brutal testing ground imaginable: Pacific combat during World War II. They proved it so conclusively that even decades of silence couldn't erase their contribution once the story was finally told. So here's the question this story leaves us with. When we look at minority cultures, oppressed peoples, languages spoken by small populations, traditions that seem obsolete, what knowledge are we missing? What unique perspectives are we losing? What strategic assets are we destroying because we don't recognize their value until it's too late? The Navajo Code Talkers suggest that the answer might be profound. The knowledge that saves us might come from the cultures we've been trying to eliminate. The solution to our next crisis might be hiding in a language spoken by a few thousand people in a remote community we've never thought about. The future might depend on preserving the past we're currently destroying. In 1942, the United States was desperate. American forces were losing the Pacific War. Every military code had been broken. Soldiers were dying because the enemy knew everything. The solution came from 29 young Navajo men who'd been beaten for speaking their language in government schools. They walked into a room with nothing but their language, their culture, and their willingness to serve. They walked out 8 weeks later with a code that would never be broken. Not once, not ever. 0 compromises in tens of thousands of messages across 3 years of savage warfare. That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That's the power of indigenous knowledge applied to modern problems. That's what happens when you preserve diversity instead of destroying it. That's what those 420 Navajo Marines taught us. The question is whether we learned the lesson.